Thanks, Joel.
Yes, we are live.
Welcome to the final panel, the second day of the undergraduate students' dissertation symposium. I'm Rohit Mazumdar and I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture. Of all the things in life, if anything is constant, it is flux. And this panel is going to focus on flux in society and in space. We have with us Dr. Kush Patel and Vishwanath Kashikar, joining us and continuing from the previous session, which they were moderating. So I'll introduce them very briefly. Dr. Kush Patel is a faculty member in and head of studies for the postgraduate arts program in technology and change at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology of Higher Education in Bangalore. Vishwanath Kashikar teaches at the Center for Environment Planning Technology in Ahmedabad. Welcome, Kush. Welcome, Vishwanath. On this panel, we have three students, Riddhi Chavan, Kshitija Akre, and Sanjana Habde, all the three of whom are exploring flux in their own ways, in different settings. And perhaps it's a coincidence that all of these explorations are being taken up in what were pastoral settlements. Riddhi Chavan explores the flux of transformation in a pastoral settlement that's now become an urban village on the outskirts of Mumbai. Kshitija takes us to her own village in Palghar district, north of Mumbai, which is a fishing village which is experiencing an intensity of transformation from pastoral, agricultural, as well as fishing activities into newer forms of work. Sanjana takes us to the environments of Bushi Dam in Lonavala and asks us, in the flux that is surrounding the dam, what is public infrastructure? So welcome, three of you. I will firstly invite Riddhi to make her presentation, followed by Kshitija and then Sanjana. Welcome, Riddhi.
Thank you, Rohit. So my thesis is entitled Historical Transformation of Urban Form, a case study of an urban village. We always assume historical importance equal to monuments like caves, temples, etc., though everything in a city is seen to be historically configured. It has its memories, marks, and traces, which almost become like an archaeological artifact that has something to speak about the past, which shouts back at the present. For example, it could be streets, roof tiles, trees, etc. This is in a way embedded into the flow of the city, and the aspirations of that space are also influenced by the flows in the city. I have lived in an apartment located partially in the Kharodi village for 15 years now. Unconsciously, I have interacted with a part of it regularly by smelling the aromas of the authentic masalas cooking while walking past the kitchen window, by listening to the loud folk songs during celebrations, or just by viewing through my window. For all these years that I have known the village, I find the present state being transformed from the earlier. In this way, I am interested to know how these changes happened and what has influenced the village to not disrupt its form entirely. Kharodi is an East Indian village having a common East Indian Marathi dialect. It is located alongside Malvi Road in Malad, West Mumbai. The origin of the village is believed to be approximately around 3 centuries back. People began to settle here as they found the soil very rich to practice farming and also with the availability of some khadis and talav around as sources of water. Today, the village consists of narrow lanes with colorful houses on either side. Each color marks a boundary for each house. A few holy crosses are mounted on an elevated platform around the village by different families. The village is deeply devoted to the Mauli Velankani, and hereby a few families have also established her grottos around. So, the focus of my study is to understand how the historical transformations of an urban village has shaped contemporary life. The objectives were to establish relationships between the historically emerging built fabric and contemporary life through the lens of transformation and find the various factors influencing the transformation in the village. To further explore this, I asked the question, how does the urban form of an urban village historically transform? What is the relationship between this historically transforming form and life in the village? The conceptual framework sets forth the fundamental concepts derived from the three readings concerning my study about the urban village. According to Christopher Alexander, a city consists of many subcultures. These subcultures, having just partial territory, are necessary to be small in size, physically separated from the other subcultures to have a distinct life cycle. Here, I identify a village precinct to be one of the many subcultures of the city. James Gibson defines affordance as what the environment can offer to an individual. I believe the life of the village continued to strive by virtue of what the people could afford from their surroundings. With Aldo Rossi's idea of primary elements existing in the city, I perceive the village wholly as an urban artifact with the lens of the multiple transformations that it has been through over time. The transformations could have either happened in a slow process that must have taken different lengths of time or by rapid changes. It is also under constant transformation by the external forces of economic, political, or expropriations. These transformations have led the village to disconnect itself from its original functions or rather have a few alterations to its functioning in its time span. Subsequently, the emergence of contemporary life in various forms is seen evidently through the village. This structure has therefore helped me to identify the contemporary life of the urban village in the forms of transactions, practices, and its built fabric. So I have identified 7 cases to understand the transformation, and out of these, I'll be talking about 3 case studies in detail. The East Indian food stall. Michael and his wife presently own a small shop of approximately 25 square feet, which is fully fabricated using steel. They open their stall every evening. They are famous for vasri kodi, chicken curry, and cutlets. Half the food is prepared from home, and some dishes like cutlets, fish fry, and bhabris are freshly prepared in the shop. 3 years back, the shop was built using plywood, timber, and asbestos sheets. The business started 25 years ago by first selling goti soda on the same spot. Back then, he had built a stall using timber and zavda weaved together. As this business flourished, he expanded by renting a soda water making machine at home and also added cold drinks. A few years later, he then started selling bhakris made at home. A typical East Indian bhakri is made from rice flour on a very large tawa. As selling this was also a success, his wife accompanied him to further sell homemade chicken curry along with it. 30 years back, his family stayed together in one house. His father had practiced farming vegetables like vanga, gosara, parvar, karla, bhindi, and bhat. He also farmed on the outskirts of the village and even grew vegetables on a small patch right adjacent to his house. The house earlier was a ground level structure with a sloping roof built using stones, bricks, country tiles, and dung as plaster. Kamartala, which is ahead of Ratwadi village, was the only source of their drinking water. The house had a large veranda which was very active throughout the day. Most of the space was occupied by vessels filled with water and other utensils as they mostly cooked food there on a chula. Today, the house has been expanded that took over most of the plot land they own and is divided amongst them. Today, each of them lives separately with their own respective families. Today, it is a ground plus one structure with the upper floor connected by an exterior staircase. The veranda space is squeezed by the extension of the kitchen and living room space. The market. Kharodi is popular for its fish market, which is situated along the Marvi Road. People from the village as well as other areas visit the market daily. Women from Mud and Bhatti Kolivada come here to sell fish daily. The nature of the present fish market is visibly open to all and is seen to open up as an opportunity for people to start selling from different areas as well. For instance, a person selling started selling plastic ware during COVID as he found out these were in high demand by the locals here. The origin of the market began as a common place for the people of Karodi and Vratwadi villages to exchange the produce with the other villages residing near the stream. People living alongside this, People living along the seaside came here to exchange directly paniche mavre for fruits, vegetables, rice, and vice versa. The earlier fish market was in the form of a cluster, partly on the grounds of the infant Jesus chapel. The market in this form was well defined, and there was a lot of negotiations happening in a confined space, which evoked a lot of pain. In 2012, the chapel acquired the whole ground, due to which the market had to be evicted. As a result, the market splattered along the footpath of the main road. Women selling fish in larger quantities acquired spaces along the footpath, whereas other women started acquiring spots along the roadside. Bella, a dweller in the village, sells fruits and vegetables brought from the Manori market here daily. Sometimes she also sells freshly made bhakris and homemade lonso. She had a house just beside her spot. Due to the road extension project, her house got abolished and got compensation for an apartment in Bhumi Park. Despite this, she continues to sell at the same spot daily. Upgraded houses. Nearly 25 years back, the density of the houses was lesser than that of today. The earlier houses were very scattered in nature and had more open spaces between them for different activities. Reading, farming vegetables, and cooking were majorly carried out by many families in these spaces. When the families felt the urge to live individually, they divided their houses by extending the existing built form horizontally or vertically with an exterior staircase leading the internal lanes to get more narrow. In this instance, a family had established a holy cross in front of their house to pray together with their neighbors. Years later, they decided to move out of the village, and as an investment, they decided to build a small three-story apartment by utilizing most of the plot area. In consequence, they had to restore the Holy Cross a little ahead of the plot boundary. Likewise, a few families in the village have upgraded the existing house into apartment building as an investment. The existing apartment buildings around the village precinct were earlier farmlands belonging to different families. As the economy changed, the demand for land increased. Consequently, a group of farmlands merged to transform their land into an apartment. There are other cases that I'll quickly go through: the butcher, the bicycle mechanic, the open ground, and shortcuts. So, to conclude, I have identified five forms of transformation. From the case studies, I analyzed that Michael's house and food stall has transformed with the changing economy. The structure of his stall is now more permanent, whereas his house is extended vertically and horizontally. This new infrastructure divides the house separately for each family member. The road extension project of Marve Road has brought in a new typology in the built form. The new infrastructures are catering to both public and private. To add to this, coaching classes, gyms, bicycle repair, butcher shops, etc., have also emerged due to the increased exposure of the public using the shortcuts. A few families have also started a small business by setting up a grocery shop in front of their house. In the case of upgraded houses, a change of ownership is observed as a few people have the idea of investing in rental units. They have converted their house into small apartments. As a result, the villages seem to be mixed up with the other cultural backgrounds. Also, a few families have sold the farmlands located around the village precinct to developers due to high property value. The market and the banyan tree set an example of a change in social associations as its physical form changed from one to another. The functions of both these examples, even after the transformation, have been constant. However, both these spaces are no longer experienced like in earlier times. As there is an increased movement of the public through the village, especially along with the shortcuts, a change of social relationship is evidently experienced. The houses have transformed to be more private by taking the veranda space inside the house that offered a medium to connect with the outside. It is apparent that the village itself has produced the necessary change when the economy changed. The shift has also resulted in increased intensity of various aspirations. However, there is an internal energy existing within the village precinct to kind of readjust and readapt itself to the new economy, which helps it to become contemporary. Thank you.
Thanks, Riddhi. That was lovely seeing those drawings in the form of a graphic novel and the role of architectural ethnography in exploring fragments of the weave of life and build form as they change within the urban village and through micro stories. I will invite Kshitija Akre to make a presentation.
Transformation in chinchani. How do work practices in pastoral settlement shape the sense of space? The question is framed in the landscape of the transforming work culture of the people inhabiting the village. In the settlement, everything happens in small proximity, and individual places have narrative for themselves for work, thus to map the changing sense of space due to the change in work practices. In order to understand the transformation, I am looking at the three concepts: type, affordance, and pattern, because it gives the sense of space. Alderossi focus on the history, collective life, and the functional aspect, which becomes the integral part in which the space is read. He draws out the city as a continuity of thoughts and the places where the past and the present collides to make a way for future aspiration, contradicting to the so-called idea of the city as an element with physical attribute. Gibson says the presence of human is responsible for the activities generated in space. The space is tailored with their skills to inhabit according to their needs for new form of life through the skills in material aspect where their affordance in the space change with it. The type and the affordance starts to build up with the form and function required in the space, and pattern to evolve by stitching the activities in large fabric. The community in Chinchani sets the home along the western coast of the Palgar, configuring the space around them to facilitate different work practices, which is 7 to 8 kilometers away from railway station. To understand the work practices changing, I have selected 3 swatches in the settlement where different practices are happening. Swatch 1 near the coast, swatch 2 Khadi, and swatch 3 Wadi. The settlement has a strong sense of spatial hierarchy within themselves, a hierarchy that defines the movement and asserts the importance of space. The main road of the settlement acts as the spine that views in the settlements together. Small roads connect to the main street at junctions that becomes the node of interactions among the flocks. A disconnect from the fishing activities that contribute towards a change in the way of life, leading to the transformation of house from to accommodate for the living activities that people are leading towards. Changing settlement in terms of work economy and the change in infrastructure and build form is comprised. So I have drawn the tools in which the people required every day to work to capture the objects in the space, which shows a collection of way of being in the space where each collection of sample has its value. Earlier, during fishing season, the people used to build temporal structures on the coastal side for work, where the space was structured with the objects of the tools around them were used for work. The large courtyard and the open space were used to dry, store, and repair the nets. This made the edge to be an extended part of the workspace where there was a visual connectivity. The nets were dried and mended by the men with the young boys sitting and learning. The courtyard became the shared place of the houses where the strong sense of community allowed the settlement to be porous. Now, because of new practices, the coastal edge have evolved into the new public space. It acts like a relief spot. Because of the increase in density in the settlement, the people have no long-lasting structure. The permanent workspace is spread into the large portion, making the swatch huge and dense, where huge concrete blocks come over very close to each other, where there is less visual connectivity. The landscape, the landscape of the settlement has changed to the requirement of the needs in the space. Overall, the landscape together form a fabric. Children play in these places and women use them for daily chores. Sculpt, where the extended roof are crafted with bamboos and woods. Now, now the extended space vertically, vertically, vertically into concrete blocks. Sorry. Right. Where the extended roof crafted with the bamboos and wood. Now the aspiration of having modern house have extended the space vertically into the concrete blocks. Houses are G+1 story with front porches or verandas forming an extensions to the street, offering offering a part of house front to the street, allowing the activities to bleed into the extension. Earlier, the edge of the khadi was open for fishing and it was an active spot. They used to keep the boat near the berth of the khadi. The built form was structured in the way that the affordance of the space overspilled the work outside the house boundary. Now the edge is filled with the thick mangroves covering the khadi, where settlers have built places for prawn cultivations and another for cleaning and salting and storing. Beside the new spaces of handcraft, tie making, flower making, and mandirs have come up. Within the house boundary, the type is structured in the manner that includes work practices where the handcraft tie making a constant set of space in the veranda. Transformation has happened as a result of future generation being engaged in activities beyond their everyday involvement with fishing. Youngsters are opting to the further education and set up their own business. Even, even if on a smaller scale, some opt to educate themselves further to aid their fishing business, while others prefer to do new practices. They spend time engaging in these things apart from daily inputs that fishing needs. The house grows according to the changing social and financial conditions. It, on, it was only the ground structure first. With rising income, the family decided to add another floor. Earlier, the tree surrounded the house became the boundary line as the space was functioning on the temporal activities, allowing many peoples to participate and work together. The open space outside the house became the space of interaction for people, net weavings happening, washing, sorting, storing water, hanging clothes on rope, fish segregation were happening. The space around them became the space for storage. Now, the practice have happened in the front yard of the houses or the people built some small work practices near the houses. Patch of grey blocks have emerged in the landscape due to the increase in housing, majorly because of the extended family, workspace, new business spot, new work practices, holiday homes have come up. A solid word defines the boundary line has the given the idea of property and space because space have become more personal to oneself. The land was dense with grain bearing, a small piece of open, dense green land of fruits and flowers like mangoes, coconut and jamun, etc. that was surrounded by house on all the side. For a long time, nobody bothered to take care of this piece of land and thus one of the residents from the adjoining house started to maintain it and use it as a cultivation for fresh vegetables for themselves, as they were the only one interested in the well-being of the space. So to conclude, the settlement as the whole has various networks and their dynamic change seen at every turn. The type of housing now seems to be dense and extended in the modern form of living and work practices transform over the period of time. Increase in income have changed the space according to their aspirations. Thus, the space affords the work practices to happen inside the dedicated space. Pattern. Earlier, the space were crafted to maintain the blur, which allows the work and living to overlap at the same time. Now the spaces are programmatically designed for work and living. Thank you.
Thanks, Kshitija, for opening out two moments in time in change in work practices in the village and their implications on spatiality. I will invite Sanjana Habde to make her presentation.
Hi, I'm Sanjana, and through this research, I'm trying to understand infrastructures, their relationships, and also trying to open up about their temporal characteristics. Due to the large impact of the pandemic in the cities, my family decided to shift to a second home in Khandala. My thesis was triggered by a small conversation between my mom and my housemaid on a rainy day. Gently sweeping the floor, Sangeeta Maushi said,
अरे मैडम, भोसी डैम का पानी चालू हो गया है। मेरे लड़के के स्टॉल पर जरूर आना।
अरे तू तो बोली वो रिक्शा चलाता है।
बरसात के टाइम स्टॉल पर काम करते, बाकी साल रिक्शा चलाते।
What intrigued me was how people of Lonavala and Khandala changed their occupation as per the peak season demand. This raises the concern that public infrastructures create social, spatial, and economic shift in its surroundings, and thus it is necessary to understand the relationality of its form and the urban ecology that it lends towards. And thus, the research further inquires about how do public infrastructures lend themselves in creating urban ecologies. To delve deeper into the study, I unfold infrastructure and urban ecology through definitions and debates. Infrastructures are commonly understood as the physical built systems, like the pipes, roads, cables, and are often the binders and integrators of urban space. But their form also tends to open up conflicting social interests of fluid and dynamic surfaces of opportunities and transactions. Moving beyond the physical aspect of infrastructures, some scholars have also theorized that networks among people also become infrastructure to support life. Urban ecology, on the other hand, is the relationship between people and the urban environment. But the readings also open up about its shifting patterns, stating that they are not constant but they evolve and shift with time. And so, to examine this, I chose Bushi Dam as my case study in Lonavala. The methodology approach here is to study the dam through its historical and cyclical timeline in order to trace various shifts and patterns. The history begins in 1870s when Bushi was a small settlement on the outskirts of Lonavala. The area housed approximately 15 families who were intensively engaged in farming and relied on forests and natural water sources for their living. By the late 1860s, the construction of railway networks began. In order to supply water for steam engines, they planned to build a dam on the highest terrain for an easier supply of water. Being constructed along the settlement, it reconfigured the entire landscape, thus resulting the entire settlement to shift. The dam later got constructed in 1876 and its form and steps gave rise to a new form of terrain. Post-independence, as trains started to run on electricity, the dam's water was now supplied to the residents of Lonavala. In this case, fewer villagers set up shops on flatter terrain away from the steps. When local railways connected Lonavala, a large number of tourists visited the dam. They would tend to occupy the steps in order to enjoy its overflowing water feature. The villagers relocated their setups ahead by stacking and rearranging the rocks. These setups, however, were unable to withstand the force of the flowing water and thus were needed to be replaced. In order to avoid the water flow, the villagers built permanent plinths and elevated their shops. According to the historical shift, the dam's construction gave rise to a new form, which shifted existing ecologies but also introduced newer ones. This says that the space thus gradually evolved to be more accessible, interactive, and was also seen as an opportunity for economic growth. thus allowing for the addition of diverse build forms. Moving ahead, the dam experiences multiple changes as it progresses through its cyclical time frame.
बापरे काय मस्त धुकं आलंय बघ.
10 रुपया प्लेट. वडापाव 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 10 रुपया प्लेट.
अरे नेहा चल ना खाऊया.
वडापाव चलो बद्दा ऊपर जाइए पानी में सेल्फी ले.
अरे बापरे खूपच पाऊस वाढलाय. चला लवकर स्टॉल मध्ये जाऊन भजी खाऊया गरम गरम. नाही तर खूप गर्दी होऊन जाईल तिकडे.
The steps act as recreation space for tourists, whereas the hawkers occupy elevated rocks in order to dodge the gushing water. To escape heavy rains, the shops serve as rest spots for the tourists.
અરે અરે શાર્દુલ, આગળ બહુ સ્લીપરી છે. હાથ પકડીને ચાલ વરના ફિસલી જઈશ.
Thus, during monsoons, as the flowing water makes its way through the infrastructure, it makes its surfaces wet and slippery. Here, people tend to occupy elevated surfaces and thus activities are spaced out across the area, resulting in an expansion in the use of space.
चलो चलो, वहाँ पानी में पैर डाल के बैठते हैं.
हाँ चल मजा आएगा.
काय मस्त थंड हवा आहे ना आज. किती बरं वाटतंय.
हाँ यार, शाम तक यहाँ ही बैठते हैं.
In winter, as the water doesn't flow over the steps, the tourists move towards the reservoir edge, whereas the hawkers come closer towards the dam steps.
ले लो बुड्ढी का बाल ले लो. 20 का 1, 50 का 3.
नाना चिक्की मिक्स चिक्की लोणावळ्याची फेमस चिक्की आहे साहेब घ्या हो. हो ताई घ्या चिक्की घ्या हो चिक्की.
As it's cold and breezy, people tend to occupy open spaces, resulting the shops to be empty. And since the number of tourists reduce, fewer food shops are now shut and unoccupied.
अरे बिंदु, बरसात के पहले सूखी लकड़ियाँ ढूंढते हैं अपने चूल्हे के लिए.
हाँ हाँ दीदी चलो.
काय राव उन्हाळ्यात इकडं कोणीच नसतंय. सगळं रिकामं आहे इकडं तर.
हो ना यार पावसाळ्यातच जाऊया.
गोळा घ्या गोळा बर्फाचा गोळा. गोळा घ्या गोळा बर्फाचा गोळा.
यार કેટલી ગરમી છે અહીંયા, બેસી પણ નથી શકતા.
And because there are fewer tourists in the summer, it affects people's participation, interactions, and thus economic activity. As a result, the villages use the steppe as their own small market to sell dried branches. Most of them move towards other cities for work opportunities, leaving the shops and stalls completely empty for the next 4 months, which results in a landscape of scattered unused objects. Through the timeline study, the form of the infrastructure may seem static, but this case draws attention to the ways in which, apart from people and the physicality of the dam, here the weather, meaning the atmosphere and the climate, becomes an infrastructure for the support and extension of life. During monsoon, the overflowing water makes the surfaces wet, slippery, and covered in layers of moss, which, in a way, forces people to occupy higher surfaces and shops, also resulting in the activities to be scattered along the space. Whereas, during winters, the surfaces are half damp and cold, which makes people occupy outer spaces and thus the shops remain empty. Likewise, during summer, the rocks get hot and rough, which doesn't convince people to experience the space, and thus the use of the space is now completely shrunk. The research thus establishes a relation that a change in the materiality of a public infrastructure creates and can even shift the urban ecology around it. This thus results in the expansion and contraction of space. The characteristics of infrastructures are thus seen to be temporal, dynamic, and of interchanging experiences. And so, if public infrastructures shape temporal urban ecologies, then how can design fields integrate such temporalities in the imagination of the social life around an infrastructure?
Thanks, Sanjana. Sanjana, for me, it was blurred, the presentation. I don't know about the others. So if you want to share your presentation, maybe you can share it in the chat box. But for me, it was very blurred. I was just thinking through the 3 presentations and the intersections between them. And what struck me most prominently three different ways of thinking about the intersections of time, space, and society. In this work, you see fragments of time in opening out flux. Fragments that open out micro stories. In Kshitija's work, she orchestrates two moments, then and now, which immobilizes to think about the relationship of time and work in terms of changes in work practices. And in Sanjana's case, she mobilizes time or flux as an intersection of linear time and cyclical time. Three ways of thinking about flux that open out through these presentations. I will invite Kush and Vishwanath to articulate their comments and observations around the three presentations. We'll take responses from the three presenters and then open it up to the audience. So either of you, Vishwanath or Kush, would like to go first.
Vishwanath, did you raise your hand? You're good? Okay. Okay, so I'll try. Riddhi, Kshitija, and Sanjana, what a delightful set of works. Just extremely joyful to sort of see your approach to research, and something that I could see connecting all three of you is a deep sense of connection with the place that you were studying, the relationships that you're entangled within, and the contexts that define you as well as the context of research. So there's a deep entanglement of the researcher in these contexts. In terms of forms of presentations with Riddhi, you know, it was wonderful to see a very incremental nature of your presentation in the form of tiles that kind of told the story of how the same urban village is incrementally growing. So you're walking us through the very process that you have been able to sort of condense and synthesize in your work. With Kshitija, you know, these deep sections that really came to the fore, and deep sections through life, but as Rohit was mentioning, through time as well. And there was a sense of a comparative matrix that was emerging, how life could be understood in relation to those deep cuts through homes and landscapes. And in Sanjana's case, a brilliant scroll that at times went vertically, but at times went horizontally, just to be able to sort of think of a much more syncretic, but also a kind of a multidimensional sort of inhabitation of the world, that shifts are happening, but shifts are happening all around us, and particularly for the communities and individuals that are living there. So beautiful, beautiful. I'm just sort of going through my notes and just wanting to sort of acknowledge what I've also appreciated in your works. Another thing that I could see in all three works is, you know, a sense of, you know, in Hindi, there's a word called Teherav, you know, there's a sense of the pacing of your projects is such that it's not rushing. And that sense of research, which is slow, a sense of research which is slow, not in terms of time, but slow because it forces you to draw and pay attention to what's important, what's significant. I really appreciated that. A sense of close reading of texts, as it were. The question that I have for all three of you as a way to get started on this conversation, also because each place spoke a specific dialect or language. And I want to sort of know from you, what is the name for flux in those dialects and languages? Flux is a very academic way of looking at this context, but how might the people who are living in these worlds, how might they characterize what you are seeing as flux? Is there a name for it? Is there a description for it? Is there a direction of flux? And what are its limits? So, because it's such a close sort of encounter and entanglement with the context, what is the name for flux? In which direction do you think that phenomenon is happening, and what might be its limits, and who gets to set those limits? So if you can think through those, that would be great. I also wanted to just sort of say that, yes, I mean, thanks for, making clear some of your theoretical references. Sometimes I wonder about Rossi and Rossian sort of a priori notions of type in contexts which are a posteriori, in terms of sort of constantly, changing in ways that are not so Platonic to begin with. So I kind of, have a tense relationship with Rossi there. But I definitely, welcome this text on Infrastructure Lives by Graham and Macfarlane. It's something that has been with me as well. And thinking through questions of networks, but networks as deeply agentic, that there is a certain agency with which we construct those networks, but there's also a certain agency with which we understand, again, the limits of those networks. So I just wanted to sort of share all of these thoughts and come back to those questions of name, directions, and limits of flux to possibly invite us to a larger conversation.
Thanks, Kush. That's a lovely question. Vishwanath.
Yeah. Well, I'll add on to the general question first and then get to the individuals. So continuing this discussion of flux, and what is our point of reference to view flux? So are we imagining that we are inside the flux? So and therefore we are experiencing society or our environment change as we go along? Or are we standing outside it and observing it ebb and flow? So I think one, of course, is the multiple definitions or ways of imagining flux itself. But if in one imagination, I almost imagine it as a flow of water in a river, say, for example, and I'm very clear that it's just one way of imagining. My question is, are you inside the water and therefore you keep traversing different geographies, different lands and reach somewhere? Or are you standing by the river bank and observing water flow by more in monsoon, less in winter? And therefore, what kind of value or what kind of understanding do we get by studying the flux? Yeah. And at what temporal scale are we studying this flux? Because again, I found it very interesting that on one hand, say Sanjana's thesis, where she's when she's talking of the Bushi Dam, it's almost a seasonal and a cyclical sort of study of flux that she's doing. Whereas when we look at the transformation studies, I think both Riddhi and Kshitija study, it seems to be a study of flux where the time frame is much larger. Maybe it's transformation over 30 years, 40 years, or maybe even more. So I think this question of the temporal scale of flux. So one is whether it is directional, unidirectional, or whether it is cyclical, and how do those two imaginations of flux take us in different directions, and at what temporal scale do we study it? What I found interesting is that I think both in Riddhi's study and Kshitija's study, where they were looking at it in detail uh, on transformations of urban villages or transformation of urban villages, what came across, I think the one thing that common thing that came across was the idea of how do you value land, or what is your relationship to land, uh, and the value that you place on it. And both of you were sort of implying that when the value of land directly gets tied to the area of land, or when that value becomes transactional in nature, that the land costs this much, uh, it definitely changes the way we look at land. And I felt what would also be interesting is to look at the thinning of boundaries between different parcels of land, which also came across, I think, in Kshitija's study as well, when she was drawing these, uh, 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 making these plans, and when she was showing what it was like earlier, and where were the boundaries between one house and another house, or one house in the forest. Maybe in earlier times, those boundaries are a bit blurred, or the boundaries are thick. And now when you start putting monetary value on land, it becomes really thin. Another aspect which I felt, again, both Riddhi and Kshitija, you might benefit from is asking what is the local unit of measurement of land. So along with Kush's question of what is the in local language, how do they look at flux? I think the local unit of measurement is also a very interesting way of understanding how they view land. Because if I look at the idea of the bigha or the gunta, if I look at these traditional ways in which land is looked at, no one says that I have 2.186 bighas of land, right? Your smallest subdivision would be 2.5 bighas or 3 bighas. Whereas the moment you move to a square meter or square foot way of measuring land, uh, you start looking at its value very differently. So even if you are able to somehow trace how people approach the questions of land, it would become very interesting. I think some of it, I also find Madhav Gadgil's and Guha's book on the fishered land, where it talks of the British state and the revenue department, and how they changed the notion of ownership of land, very pertinent to the kind of questions that you're asking. In Sanjana, in your case, what I found very interesting was uh, there were two kinds of flux that you were talking of. Uh, you started your presentation by talking of this person who is driving a rickshaw for some time and then doing some other work for some other time. So I think this idea of seasonal work or shifting work patterns, I think, is also another dimension that you started off with. uh, I would suggest you take it a bit forward as well, because in the second part of the study, you are primarily concentrating on flux in the way the space is used. So when you were looking at the Bushi Dam and the steps, it primarily became of how in different seasons, people are using that space differently. And I find this idea of uh, having multiple jobs uh, and sort of shifting between one and the other. Uh, Also, a very interesting study. And again, I think this happens with many people in India, right? I mean, a lot of migrant laborers in cities, for example, always go back uh, to the hinterland when it is harvesting season, for example. And so their ideas of what is urbanity, what is city, what is village, or where do they reside and where do they work, I think becomes very complex. And I thought that that was another dimension of your study that you could touch upon. Yeah, I really liked in this session, in this panel, I really liked how each of the three of you are presenting drawings in a very different way. I think Kush already talked about Riddhi, your case where it was a series of unfolding tiles, which I found fascinating. Kshitija, in your case, I really like the first two drawings also that you made of the village, which had lot of scribbles on it. And uh, I'm really glad to see that drawing, because one of the things that happens in a final presentation like this is we just see sanitized drawings, if I might call them sanitized. They are sort of pretty, and that veneer of prettiness I'm increasingly having more problems with, because it does not allow us to engage in talking of drawing as a thinking tool. Drawing is becoming a presentation tool. So I really love those first two drawings of yours. And in Sanjana, in your case, I think the recordings really added. I mean, let us engage with the drawings in a very different way, which would not be possible if those recordings were not there. So I really like the fact that this in this panel, drawing has been used in very different ways as well.
Thanks, Vishwanath. So there are a range of questions there, but just before you all start responding, I just want to kind of, just what comes to mind in the questions that Kush and Vishwanath posed is there a relationship between what Kush asked about flux and the kind of drawings that Vishwanath is asking about? Does a certain way of thinking about flux in your work lend towards a certain way of thinking about drawings? Is there a relationship there? That's what came across my mind. So, yeah, you can feel free to respond to this entire discussion. It's a lot to chew upon there. Anybody from you particularly would like to go first?
Yeah, I can go. So, Kush, to answer you, flux would mean to go, it is a process of flowing. So, in my, in the native language of the East Indians, typically Marathi, we say it is wahane, like you need to, it means wahane. And to connect to Vishwanath's question, is that the village is neither inside the flowing river, it is away from the bank. But with time, the river is either bulging out towards them or it is shrinking. For example, I can give you that during the British era, so there were people even breeding goathas. There were a lot of goathas in the village, and people they stop breeding buffaloes and all. It's because they found opportunities in uh, they found jobs during the British era, as they knew a bit of English and Marathi, so that was an advantage for them to get hired in the British era. So because of which they stopped breeding those uh, 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 buffaloes, and then eventually they took over those goathas. Another example I could give you is that again, as time passed by, the farmlands again got converted. People acquired the farmlands to again expand themselves. So, in a way, um, at some point they got submerged into the flow of the river, and at some point they even got, the river itself got away from them. It's almost like it gets submerged and then it gets away a little, at some point. So yeah.
Thanks.
Can I go next?
Yes, sure, please.
So, I would just start by saying that. So initially, I was thinking infrastructure as like the physical built forms, and then through readings, I went into knowing more about people as networks, and through the cyclical timeline, I went I understood that the weather here is something is the main. So through the summer, winters, and monsoon, the weathers create a change in the materiality of the textures, and that is how it defines where people would stand, people would occupy spaces. And so in a way that
in a way that the atmosphere or the slipperiness or the hardness of the rocks in a way determines how people would occupy the space. If it is cold outside or the rocks are damp or cold, people tend to move out. But if it is slippery or it has moss, then people would tend to occupy higher or go inside the shops. And so the direction, what I'm looking through in the end part was through the cyclical time frame, and the limitations here would be first through the economical approach, that the opportunities that keeps on changing, and also in the way that the shops or some of the stalls are unoccupied, like are completely unoccupied during summers. So there's a transformation because of the weather, and also in the way that spaces keep on getting occupied and unoccupied. So that is how I'm trying to understand flux.
Thanks, Sanjana. You want to come in, Kshitija?
Yeah, I want to give answer to the question direction of the flux, because first the fishing was the main occupation over there, and in settlement everything around was of only fishing. But because of the new practices around the settlement, like Tarapu, MIDC, new factories come up, prawn cultivation. So there are multi directions to the multi dimensions for the businesses, and also the idea of urbanity, because it is the aspiration for the new modern form. So the settlement is moving towards the urban form of build forms like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Kshitija. I'm just wondering, I really liked both those questions that Kush and Vishwanath posed. And just wondering in some of the things that the three presentations and the way in which the three presenters have responded. So I want to build a little bit more on what they spoke. I'm just wondering in Riddhi's graphic novel kind of presentation, and although she used the term vahane, which is flow and is unidirectional, but the graphic novel locates the past in the present. And there is a weave that emerges the way she kind of presents that. There's a particular way of thinking about time which she locates in her text, in her writing, as I've read her abstract, which kind of powerfully opens that up. So my thing to you, Riddhi, would be at what moment that although people speak of time in terms of vahane, the flow, which is unidirectional, but actually the way in which the narrative gets constructed is something that goes back and forth. So at what moment and how does that emerge critically in terms of thinking methodologically? In Sanjana's work, the intersection between linear and cyclical time, Sanjana seems to be short of telling us and shy of telling us that atmosphere is infrastructure. That she kind of alludes to the fact that it changes materiality but doesn't push it forth. And probably over here is a proposition where scholars on infrastructure have asked questions about what is infrastructure, and to try to make infrastructure animated, lively, beyond its physical manifestation, which carries and moves things, whether it is pipes, channels, so on and so forth, which move people, water, sewage, electricity, so on and so forth. But in the temporality that she kind of engages with, what comes across is when is infrastructure and for whom? And that temporality opens up several interesting questions about infrastructure. Those relationalities between not only between people and the physical manifestation, but also atmosphere seems very important to consider over here. And Kshitija, in her case, I thought the way in which time opened up between in the then and the now section was the linear, the time which was unidirectional in that flow. So that's where the relationship of the drawing to the way in which time is thought about kind of came across in their presentation. That's what I was stuck about. This is why I really like these questions that both of you posed. Yeah. We'll take one more round of questions if you all want to take this conversation further, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But I thought Kush had a set of questions which he's held and might probably want to pose.
I wanted to sort of, it's honor this conversation. I think it's just brilliant. But I wanted to sort of ask students to dwell on what your learnings have been. Hold certain insights that you have gained from your research. So, for example, Riddhi, when I heard you say, and I've noted it down here, that adjustments is what makes this community or place contemporary. Now, that's a very deep insight. Adjustments making a place contemporary. So then it really kind of, returns you back to where you started to be able to sort of understand, but what is the nature of adjustments and what are the complexities within it. And likewise for Sanjana, you mentioned that weather is an infrastructure for life. Now that's a very brilliant, insightful thought. And if weather is an infrastructure for life, what and where are the disruptions? So, insights that you have gained, hold on to them because they will sort of open up ways in which you can start re-looking at the same contexts that you have studied over the past 4 months. And likewise for Kshitija, it's a fishing community. And throughout your presentation, as vivid and descriptive it was, I was sort of longing to see, but who gets to define this? It was almost as if there was a modern distinction between work and life, but that may not be where the fishing community comes from. What is work for them? And how is it integrated and woven into what you are calling life? And so these deep weaves of where you work, how you work, who works, is something to hold on to as well. Another quick question I had was, not so sanitized as Vishwanath was thinking, or kind of cautioning all of us against this. But there's this idea of flux also. Not really working for individuals and groups within those environments. So what are the cracks? What are the fissures? Where are the differences, either based on one's class, one's gender, one's faith, one's caste? What are the differences, even within these landscapes of flux, temporalities of flux, that you might want to sort of, draw attention to as something that becomes crucial for you to sort of say that, yes, even when adjustments become contemporary, adjustments for a select few are even more urgent to look at and to sort of then work with, as opposed to, staying at a kind of a general level of adjustments. So I'm just sort of inviting you to go deep with some of your own insights and hold them in your mouth, hold them in your hands, hold them with your bodies, because they're deeply, deeply affective. There are some, very deep emotions connected to the works that you're doing. So.
Nice. Vishwanath, would you like to take this conversation forward? And then we'll invite, or I could ask students to respond. Your choice.
Yeah, maybe students could respond and then join in.
Okay. Riddhi, would you like to respond to that provocation of mutual adjustment? I'm taking it a little further from adjustment to mutual adjustments.
I think I'll go later. I just need to think about it.
Sanjana, what are the cracks in the temporal changes that take place? What kinds of cracks do you observe amongst the different groups of people that form the ecology of the urban ecology of the infrastructure?
Like in terms of maybe the differences is one thing, that even if the dam's water is for the residents of Lonavala, but the villagers or the people who are occupying it are not the ones who get the water. So even like in that case, they're not allowed to place their stalls or shops there, but it is something that they have evolved doing it because of that temporal, I mean the weather, seasonal, like the tourist season of Lonavala. So, so in terms of distractions is something that even if weather would give an opportunity, but like in the real, there would be two contrasting ends where maybe the railway people who built the dam would be against the villagers, and like there are distractions in like in the political ways. So,
So probably what you're trying to draw attention to, Sanjana, is the fact that, I mean, what you're trying to say, correct me if I'm wrong, and probably you're trying to build this, that although there is an opportunity in a certain season that lends itself to tourism, that opportunity is not stable. It is not necessarily equitable in that sense, and that constitutes a fissure. What is infrastructure for recreation for a certain group of people becomes an infrastructure for work for other sets of people. And there may be certain fissures within those. I'm just wondering if that is what emerges from the drawings that you were showing us, Temporal. Kshitija, would you like to respond?
Yeah. So the crack and the flux. So first, because first there like I will talk one practice. Handcraft dye making was only done by panchals, and after some time, like fishing communities, which is mangelas, they started going for the going like intern करने लगे वहाँ पे the youngsters. So because of that, because there was hard work in fishing practices and less income was there, and this was like building up like gradually in the coastal edge of the western coastal edge. So because of that, the practices have been changed towards the different things. So yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, to answer this, I'll give you an example. So during the start of my research, so it was during this after the second wave, I guess, and I was trying to find some contacts within the village. So I had a school friend. I knew that she's staying, I mean, in Kharodi, but I wasn't sure if she's staying in the village itself. So I contacted her, and then I just asked her, that can I just come over to your place? I need some help and everything. So she said that I stay here on rent and I just can't help you with it because I mean, we don't speak to anyone over here, and it's been like more than 4 years for us to. We are still living there, but yet she wasn't like willing to help me out, with some information over there. So even though people have started giving rental units, like there are rooms available for rent, yet there is no what do you say, harmony amongst the people. Like I've seen while walking through the village, I saw few Muslims, I saw few North Indians as well, but there's no as such bond I saw, with these rental units, that when people started you know taking up these rooms. So yeah, that was something a bit surprising for me, that I just thought that maybe my friend could help me, but then she said no. And even though she's a Catholic itself, but she's a Catholic, so even that didn't help, like for me to help. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Vishwanath, you would like to?
Yeah, I was just thinking about Kush. It's nice that you brought up these two sentences that Riddhi and Sanjana, I mean, these two insights that they had. And I was wondering about the entire process of doing a dissertation, that at times you need to hold on to something and not sort of stray and go in depth. But at other times, we also expect students to not have a tunnel vision, but keep your eyes and ears open and study different things uh, uh, and things that are happening around them. And I I was just wondering for myself, that uh, how do we start deep diving into any situation that we see or any phenomena that we see, and what are the processes by which we hold on to some things so that we don't sort of go all over this place. And I find that the moment you choose your case study or have to start looking at the spatiality of it, that is where that is when probably our default modes of thinking and drawing of space are so powerful or come at us so strongly that it deviates us from the original thought. So uh, I was reflecting back on the beginning points that some other students had also mentioned in other panels, like Riddhi, for example. In your case, when you started by this one conversation that your mother had with the person who was going back, I mean, that's such a just a powerful sentence. And if you're uh, how does one stick to that and then ensure that when we are drawing as a means of understanding society or understanding flux or transformation or whatever that is, we don't uh, end up diluting our thoughts. We what is the way in which we go deeper and deeper? Because time and again, what happens is a third person, a fresh set of eyes, looks at what you're doing, and they are able to extract bits and pieces which maybe for you is lost in the cacophony of things that you're trying to juggle with. And especially this came when Kush, interestingly, I completely missed those two sentences that you brought out in Sanjana's and Riddhi's case. And they are so insightful. And if I just dwell on those sentences for 1 month, maybe, and just study those sentences in those environments, I think it will be a powerful uh, uncovering of maybe a new reading of the spatial environment or the built environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true.
But that is the work of research too, right? Since we're having this open conversation, and students, please participate, and not just the three of you others in the room as well. That one of the questions, again, in my practice, what I ask is, who am I researching for? What is this work for? And so it's another way to sort of, not lose sight of why what you are studying is significant. Sometimes it could be significant by virtue of it giving you that that depth intellectually to sort of do a deep dive and sort of understand the context that has always interested you. At other times, there are real lives at stake, relationships at stake, environments at stake. So it keeps you honest, it keeps you accountable, and at the same time, you know, what I appreciated in all three of your works is this embrace of slowness, right? And what that does is that, and I'm not talking about slowness in terms of time, slowness as a way to be more attentive to various components of research. And what that does is that these insights that you gain, you can always, you know, I know, Vishwanath, it's hard because, you know, when you're in the thick of it, you may have insights, but you may lose sight of which one is really kind of making sense for everything that you've been doing, but also opening up this path for you to continue studying. But do that zoom in and zoom out for yourselves. And yeah, have more peer conversations as well, because that really helps sort of thinking with and within a certain community. So yeah, so the question that I had for the other panel is to who is the reader or the audience of your research?
Would you like to take this up?
Somewhere I feel that so initially, since I had lived there for 2 years, so I had honestly entered through the lens of a tourist. And as gradually as I learned about the cyclical time, and I was more interested in knowing about the lives of the villages and how they transform. So initially it was, so if it is about infrastructure or maybe that, so it is about learning and unlearning about the surface of the dam edge that we initially thought, but for residents it is the dam and the water, but for the villages it is actually only the surfaces that create that experience for different people at different times. And somewhere infrastructure is more than what is there, but when things come together, or when materials or experiences or networks come together to form a thing, rather than just seen as something which is one large thing which connects two places, but also the internal networks and all the activities or everything that goes under also it.
Yeah, nice. That's nice said. And I was wondering if that kind of connects to, I mean, if Kush is kind of pointing out who are the audiences. It's a way of unlearning the self in a certain sense that in this case, you went with a certain assumption about infrastructure.
Yeah.
It turned out to be
something else. Yeah.
It is, and that surprise, the surprise of kind of finding out something is a way of unlearning things about how you conventionally view things. Probably has a big role to play in shaping the design imagination. Yeah.
Rohit, I also feel that maybe we should also think about the how to integrate field notes and field drawings in these kind of discussions.
Yeah, that's a very lovely point, Vishwanath.
Because on one hand, I do think that these final drawings are carefully thought of and they're beautiful and they should be there. But if you're also talking of drawing as a thinking tool or as an analyzing tool, I think it's equally important to discuss and share field notes and field drawings in these kind of fora.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and we'll take it up. I'll just let Kshitija and Riddhi, if they want to respond to Kush's question. Who's your audience?
So so the research was more for me through observation, like throughout as and when I passed through the lanes and everything. And I feel that the research was itself for me to understand what was existing earlier. Because through these years, before an architect student, I never had the question to think if I saw a fishing net just lying on the ground. I never questioned why was the fishing net there. As an architect student, now I started questioning some might be fishing from the village, or then I even saw a few people, selling these vegetables and all. And so there's this old lady who's 80 plus whom I buy vegetables from. And so when I spoke to her, then I realized then when she started opening up, she was brought up in the village itself. She got married in the village itself, and in those ways, I realized that how old and how rich the village is. That how people amongst them, culturally are trying to grow within themselves and all. So with these few traces that I find, like when a person was telling me that where you stay, that apartment, there was a khadi there. So again, with these things, I started learning about this place itself, which I was been through here, and it was a learning for me itself. So I think the audience is me itself. I mean, yeah, had to learn a lot of things through my research. Yeah.
Yeah. Kshitija.
Yeah. For me also, audience is like on me because first, like I was like that Chinchani is my hometown, but I never have ever seen fishing happening. So I get to know the like how it was done, fishing and all that thing through stories from my parents and relatives. Like their people used to go for fishing every morning and come like work fair used to happen in the coastal edge. Also, like they used to transport the fish from like Chinchani to Satpati and again to Mumbai, like through buses. And so I like from like got to know more about my village. So I was the audience first, and
Okay. Thanks, Kshitija. The question about the field drawing and the analytical or the generation of narrative, the distinction between these two things. With Vishwanath's question, I'd like to open that up to the audience because the question of drawing has been a very important question that we are asking at the school as to how does one think about the drawing, especially in the dissertation, apart from it being a central question across the whole school. How do we think through the drawing? What is an architectural thesis? And what is one drawing out, essentially? And that has been a point for discussion over here. So with that, I'll open out the discussion to the audience, not only to engage with this question, but to pose other questions, comments, suggestions that you all might be having. Yeah, Shreyank, you raised your hand.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Hi. Hi, Kush again. So I just want to build on the point of the audience question. No? It's a very interesting question, very important question also. Two things come to mind. One is, just to give an anecdote. We were in Assam with, I think, this batch only. And we were looking at an old monument in a town, that a city that is not very popular on the, let's say, tourist front, but a beautiful city called Sibsagar. And we were standing underneath this ancient vault, and there was a mason who was restoring the vault, basically undertaking the conservation effort. And here we are, a group of 40 students and 4 faculties trying to discuss, quote unquote, the history of this place. And it really struck me because the mason wasn't really concerned about our discourses, our thoughts about the building. He was just carrying on with his work, and we were carrying on with our work. And I was wondering, how does this kind of, the question of the like who's the research actually for, unfold in a situation like that, So it's very since then, I mean, it's not a conclusive answer, but it kind of has remained with me. And one of the things, and even when the students are saying, I am the research is for myself, for for clarifying some thoughts that I have, it's technically in many which ways, if one think about it, most of the research actually begins, especially well, let's say, at least for me also, in my experience, has always been that a certain question or a certain doubt that that you at that moment are really, something that's bothering you at that moment. It's like, one of this writers famously mentioned that he wanted to write a book on another thinker, and he could not let himself write it because it felt as if leaving a cigarette bud and thing in a national forest, for example, because it is his imperative at that moment to kind of undertake that thing. So that's the first thought that comes to my mind. And of course, then from that stage, one might say that once you have taken up the question, then it might be interesting to ask, who are you writing for from that point onwards? Or who are you actually thinking for? Once you've clarified a few thoughts, quote unquote, for yourself, what do you do with that study? Do you engage then with a larger group of people, with your peers, with the community, and so on and so forth? I think that's the first thing about the question of audience. Just it's not very conclusive at the moment for me, but something that came to mind from this conversation. And the second is the question of flux, and particularly in all the 3 presentations, unfolding the question of time, right? And it's kind of interesting because the idea of flux is almost taken as a given, that as if it's the truth of all things. And I like what you said, Kush, that one probably needs to kind of find finer milieus and differences in that continuum in some sense. But it's probably another way to think about this, just again thinking out loud, might be to kind of bring back the question of punctuated equilibriums in some sense, instead of a flux, which is continuum, which is continuous in many ways, but to think about an idea of a punctuated equilibrium. Probably, I'm thinking also in this in a manner that, for instance, if we take McLuhan to his word, that there are, let's say, mediums that come and they sustain for some time, and they change the relationships that we are part of, in of course, in differential ways, and where actually the medium unfolds. But if you take it seriously, then that medium sustains for a certain period, right? And that there is the period of stability. And some of the drawings that were drawn today will also show that, like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's not like every minute or every hour or every day, sometimes not even every month, that this change really takes place, but sometimes takes place at punctuated times. Yeah, these are 2 thoughts that were coming to mind about from this discussion. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Shreya. Would you like somebody specifically to respond to it?
Now, even the students like because their drawings actually brought this thing. So,
anybody wants to respond or push?
Yes. In fact, I would take that further, Shreyank. First on the question of the audience. So, I think right now all the students said that they are the audience from the perspective of saying that I'm still learning, so I'm learning something new from it. Therefore, I'm the audience of it. But I think the question is asked for a different reason. I think the question is that if I say that practicing architect is the audience of this research, or if I say that the government is or policymakers are the audience of your research, to some extent it will change the way you do research. I think it is still imaginable how it would change. But if I were to tell you that rickshaw driver is the audience of your research, and you have to present it to that person, and it makes that person think about their environment, suddenly I think it forces us to imagine, what am I doing? And I think it opens up questions of what is our role as professionals or soon to be professionals in furthering the agenda of spatiality in society at large. Because I think all professionals, definitely architects, we are very insular in the sense that we always imagine our audience to be architects or would be architects. And the moment we are forced to say, no, as a professional, it is about the relationship of the professional with society. And what is the value that you bring as a professional to society at large? I think it will force all of us to think of looking at other dimensions of our research. Of course, the I will always be there. Of course, I will always learn something new from each research that I do. Of course, like Shreyank was saying, that personal motivation is extremely important to do research. But then I think, and therefore I would urge all students to take that question even further, like Kush was asking, as to what is your audience. And it's not so much about identifying the right audience, but asking yourself, okay, if the audience is a non-architect, how do I go about it? What do I do with it?
Rupali has a point, question.
I just want to like maybe take it slightly differently. Like when the student said, "I am the audience," it might have come from the point to saying that I'm learning and all of that. But I think there's something interesting there, in the sense that it's kind of the position of the researcher, where you are, and I think we've discussed this often, that the whole idea of shifting the anthropological gaze, back to yourself. And in that sense, if the idea of infrastructure for Sanjana has changed from thinking of hard infrastructure to something else, relationships and networks and other things, then I think there is something to be said in terms of really kind of thinking of I as the audience, slightly differently. Because then what you do is then, as a design practice, you shift, the vantage of from where you think, right? So I think, and that is really important, because often what happens is that when you ask that question, then it's about, who you're doing something for, and maybe somebody else, the rickshawala, or, somebody else is doing something a lot more, in a lot more profound ways than you as an expert were perhaps thinking and doing, or sort of practicing. So in that sense, I would see that that answer slightly differently. And if you see that differently, that might actually open up many things for the way you kind of also imagine this idea of the audience. So sorry, just kind of putting
Thanks for that intervention. Yeah, Kush, you like to respond?
This is great. So I'll my question about who are you researching for, who are you writing for, or who's the audience was definitely a layered question. And my advisor mentor, Linda Grote, would often ask me that sometimes the audience is a practical audience, as Vishwanath was alluding to, a practical audience, an audience that is part of the profession, is sort of orienting you to sort of think about informing and widening the limits and possibilities with design practice. But many a times the audience is personal. And Sarah Ahmad beautifully sort of describes how personal is theoretical. And I wanted to sort of ask you and to sort of invite you to sort of dwell on it, that theory, which is an understanding of theory, which is deeply lived, it's deeply situated, it's embodied, it has a material form. But if the audience of your work is personal, try and sort of hold on to that and see what are the ways in which that continues to be a basis for theoretical constructions moving forward. So be much more intentional and reflective on that question, which is another way to sort of zoom out and say, but who is the audience, is a way to ask, what is the relationship between the researcher and the researched? Sometimes the relationship is one and the same. Sometimes the relationship is one. In this panel, all three of you are deeply, as I said, entangled within the contexts that you're studying. And at other times you are, quote unquote, there are real differences of power and privilege that you're navigating. But to name those differences is the task of research as well, just so that you're able to then work on those differences and be much more honest in the kind of research that happens. Also research that happens collaboratively. So it opens up the possibility of a method which could also start becoming much more plural. So all of these are questions that hope they stay with you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kush, for that. Any other questions, comments, or responses? Would the students like to build up on this? Would Sanjana, Riddhi, or Kshitija like to respond or add to this?
Students may be like, just don't put us on the spot. We have thought enough. We want to just sit with this thought for now.
I'll just one point to make about the thing that Vishwanath brought out about the act of drawing, and how should one see the drawing in this? I think, I completely agree with you, Vishwanath, and one goes into the field through a lens that one is kind of, through a position that one kind of adopts. And one draws in the way one sees things in the field, and it's useful to not only present final drawings, but kind of present the method of how you arrived at it, probably, that drawing. And I was thinking that the role of drawing or drawing out in the research, is to kind of, you're drawing out something to intervene in a debate. And that intervention in the debate is a challenge in the role for drawing out things. So as if one can articulate this through the methods of narrative generation, whatever they are, whatever form they are, which may include fieldwork drawings, but also include argumentative drawings. How do they engage and intervene into an existing debate? I thought that's a worthwhile proposition to take up for the act of thinking about drawing out something. But if anybody wants to build up on this, and we'll take those as the final comments of this panel. We are
So yeah, I feel that in a strange way. So if you go to the field and you very quickly take photographs, for example, versus you go with a sketchbook and you, I don't know, maybe doodle or actually draw something or write something. And if I compare the idea of the photograph, of course, the photograph also, there is a curation in the sense that you are deciding which view to shoot. But there is a certain flattening of information that is there in the photograph, which is not there in the doodle or the words or the drawings that you make on site. And similarly, I feel that when we are using drawing as a communication tool and we make final drawings, again, to me, in some ways, it is similar to the photograph. It tends to flatten thoughts that we had at different points in time or thoughts of different aspects of the built form. We try and collapse it into one narrative or one set of drawings. So I think this questioning of how do you unpack a drawing or how to make unflattened drawings is something that is I'm also grappling with since almost the last year or so now, as to think carefully about how we are drawing out rather than how we are communicating or representing it, or what is the narrative that we build.
Yeah, take your point over there. Would anybody like to add to this?
It was honestly somewhere where I was stuck in how should I show the weather or the atmosphere that would shape different things. And so initially all my drawings were like the historical ones where I was looking through like a tourist point of view. Ki I go here and that is why this happens. But suddenly when I I drew initial drawings on AutoCAD, and when like Rohit said, drop this and go on site, draw in the go during the rain, sit, and that is where I personally felt that how would I choose a place to sit, or like I was maybe as a tourist point of view I would go to the steps, but if I were to be or occupy spaces like villagers or where they would sit or place things, and that is how I acquainted more with the site and went like beyond understanding or having conversations. And that is when I understood that there's a rickshaw shift, or how there are people who go from Lonavala to Surat, and that is actually how I began with the cyclical timeline.
Yeah, Rupali, you can go.
I just wanted to kind of, it just struck me just now when Vishwanath spoke about the photograph. And, I think we also there was a conversation about architecture and photography and all of that. And photography itself also has had a long history, right? Like of how you see. I'm almost wondering whether, there is a kind of, not the quick photography or a thin photography, but a thick photography, like a thick photograph that could also be the drawing out, So, and I'm just thinking of, several really rich photographers, contemporary photographers who've completely opened up, very interesting fields for us. And I'm thinking of Saurabh Hura's work recently, where he goes into completely like his photography really sort of is something else in the way it, and that's something that a drawing would perhaps not have done, or, field work wouldn't have done. So I'm just thinking, it's really kind of important, I think, to open up this idea of drawing or the drawing out to kind of a full spectrum of thinking of what does it mean to see, right? So I think that will be really useful for us to flesh out in the coming years as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rupal. I just want to, I have one point to, it struck me as Vishwanath spoke about flattening in the drawing, and what struck me was this question: the drawing reveals something. You choose to reveal something. I mean, it might be useful to ask the question, given several things, what is it that you're choosing to hide, and why are you choosing to hide? That may also be a very important question to ask, because it is not necessarily about flattening of things. The act of hiding may have several relationships that you're trying to engage with. The questions of power, the questions of research ethics, the questions of many different kinds in the act of hiding something or not revealing something. And that may not account as a flattening. So it's also always useful to ask the question the other way around too.
But it's also a deeply political tool.
Yeah.
And has always been, right? And so I think, yes, to this conversation, which tries, so in one way that we can flatten it is by making it apolitical. That's one form of flattening. But another one to sort of say that if drawing, an intentional work of drawing is, or drawing out is political, then what is the transformation that one is seeking? Because sometimes, because of the implicated politics, you draw out things that remain underground because it helps with strategy building, but you also draw things that could draw focus on things that have been occluded otherwise. So I think, you know, this, I mean, it's again, brings me back to this question of the audience that, you know, ultimately, if we know who we are researching for, then it allows us to strategize also the networks through which this knowledge gets to be continuously held to its transformative ends.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Kush. I think we'll take that as the last comment to end this session, which has been really, really rich and very engaging in terms of the questions that were posed, the observations and the comments. Particularly, I mean, those two things stand out for me about the questions about flux and questions about drawings, which is what I will take away from this discussion as something to think through further. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kush. And we'll see you tomorrow again. Thanks, Vishwanath, for being with us for the last 2 days. And it's been lovely to have you again. And you've been with us through the last 4 years. And we look forward to more conversations with you. But we'd be happy for you if you could make it in the final session of the day tomorrow. So just to have the four of you together.
That's an invitation to you to please join the last panel, because we don't want to just say bye to you now. It'll be nice to wrap up in the end.
Yeah.
So,
No,
if you have time, please.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. It's always exciting to be in these reviews. Unfortunately, I'm in a teacher's training workshop tomorrow. That's why I couldn't
no
manage tomorrow.
Okay.
But,
Thanks. So thanks a lot, Vishwanath. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sanjana, Riddhi, Kshitija, and thanks, Kush. We will see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. So lovely day. We start tomorrow at 9 a.m. for the final day, the third day of the symposium, where we'll have a set of 4 panels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vishwanath, always good to see you.
Yeah.
Take care. Yeah.
Thanks, thanks, Vishwanath. That was wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, Kush. See you tomorrow.
Bye.